Hi guys, welcome to another one of our advanced React miscellaneous modules, which will be covering a lot of topics that are helpful for web development. And in this week, we're going to be covering the React router. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about some of React's internals, like what happens when we run create React app and the differences between single page and multi-page applications, as well as how we can use external libraries like React Router DOM for emulating multiple page applications within single page applications like React. Now, before we talk about React Router, first we should take a look back and see how can we move across different websites and how is it different from websites to websites. And first, let's take a look at some plain HTML websites. And for this, I'm going to look at our Day of Code website that we set up earlier this spring. And what this Day of Code website is that it's a collection of a bunch of different other smaller websites that other people made. And if I click on one, then we can see that I go to another web page, another one, and we see a separate one. Now, going across different pages like this is something called a multiple page application. And like if we take a look at our Day of Code website, we see that when we click from one website to another, we leave the current page we're on and go to a separate one, like so. And each website we go to has its own index.html and index.css file. More importantly, one of the really cool things is that for each of these websites that we see, let me go to here, we can see that even though they all have the same class name for different things, like let's take a look at this website. There's a div called class equals home, which is basically everything. And each website has their own version of the home class and different stylings for each one. And what's really cool is that even though they all share the same name, we can see that all the styles they have are different. And let's see if we can do the same thing inside of our React application. Like, let me pull this up real quick, like this. Let's say that we have a page that has multiple different web pages embedded inside of it. And we have a first page and a second page. And what we want to do is that within our first page, we want to have a style called the dress, which has a background color of white and color of gold. And for our second page, we want to change the styling of the dress to be blue and black. And what we can see is that inside of our first page component, we properly import the style in, and we're importing first page.css, and in second page.tsx, which is right here, we import a different page with the same class name. Now, what do you think will happen if we try clicking between first page and second page? Do you think that it'll properly showcase the difference between one of them being blue and black and one of them being white and gold? Well, if you said that they're not going to be different and they're going to be the same, then you are right. And it's kind of weird, right? Like, how come, even though we've explicitly said, hey, I want first page to be white and gold with ours, I want first page.css to be white and gold, and I want second page.css to be blue and black. Why is it that we can't exactly show two different things with the same class name? And to see this, we can take a look at inspecting the element and see what happens. So let's take a look at this. What we can see is that we have div class equals the dress. And if we try clicking on it, we can see the styles on the right side. Now, as you can see, one of the dresses is crossed out. And what this means is that we have two definitions of the dress within our page. And that might be kind of weird. It's like, huh? Why is the dress represented twice within the same page, even though we have imported it differently. And the reason for that is because of something that React does internally, which uses a configuration called Webpack. Do something. And before we get into Webpack, let's see why this happens. Even though they have different index, they have different CSS files, why do they showcase the same colors? And the main reason for this is because React is a single page application. And if we talk about the differences between single page applications versus multi-page applications, we can take a look at this little thing here. So for a multiple page application, like our Day of Code website, whenever we try clicking on a thing to go to a new page, what happens is that we tell our browser, hey, I want to leave this page and go to a completely separate one, like so. If we click on Berserk, we're going to be leaving Day of Code Netlify app, and we are going to be going to a completely new website. However, in React applications, which are single page applications, instead of refreshing the entire page, what we have is that we basically have all the different possibilities that a web page can have and store them as templates. And by moving to a new page, we simply change what's showing on the page to show a different template. Like, for instance, let's say first page is template 1 and second page is template 2. By clicking across and changing our URL, instead of moving to a different page, we're simply just changing what is showing on the page. And we can see this as well inside of our code. Right. Let's take a look at our code here. If we look at our index.html, we can see that we have div id equals root. And if we look at index.tsx, what we see is that we take our entire React app and we just insert it into our root. And what this means is that all of our pages are all on the same page. And it's a single page application, which means that even though it looks like we're changing between pages, we're simply just changing what gets shown. And yeah, now to answer the question of why don't these look different? And the main reason why these don't look different is because React uses something called Webpack. And what Webpack is that it's a static module bundler for JavaScript applications. And what this means is that it combines all of our CSS, JS, TSX, asset files, and so on. And what it does is that it compiles it all onto a single page for a single page application. And let's take a look at what exactly happens when we run something like yarn start to start our website. If you look at app.css, we see that all of our style sheets across all our different CSS files, what happens is that inside of index.html, they simply get added into our head with something called a style tag. And it just inserts all of our CSS styling inside here. And that's what Webpack does for us. And this leads to some issues. Like, let's say we have even component here. If I rename even component and change background color to, like, let's say black, for instance, even this means that we have two different declarations for the class even component within the same CSS file. And that leads to why inside of here, when we try inspecting the element, taking a look at the class, the address, let's take a look at what happens. Yeah, one of them gets X'd out because one of the addresses that was higher up inside of our CSS got replaced by this one. And that's one of the things that Webpack does for us. So the main idea of Webpack is that it takes all our CSS, JS files and combines them into a single web page. And yeah, that explains why we cannot see blue and black or white and gold. We only see one or the other. And if you wanted to change that, And let's say, hey, what if we wanted to make it similar to multi-page websites and change it so that when you do click across them, you can have the same class name across different pages. And something we can do that's really cool is that Webpack gives us something called a CSS module. And what a CSS module is that it allows us to include multiple versions of the same class name. And it changes it so that instead of globally scoping our CSS classes, we can locally scope them. And to see what I mean by that, let's take a look at what happens. So we have our first page.css right here. And to change it into a CSS module, all we'll have to do is rename this to first page.module.css. And then let's do the same thing for second page.module.css. Change this to second page.module. And then inside of our first page, which is right here, instead of just importing the CSS file, we're going to import a style object from our module, because what the module does is that it allows us to import it in kind of like an object. Then we'll change class name to styles. That's the address, like so. And what if we do the same thing within second page.tsx, where we're going to import in our module and change our class name to styles address. And what this is basically, this is how we can access our styles object. And let's take a look and see what happens if we run our code. What we see is that first page is properly white and gold, and second page is properly blue and black. And how does this happen? I thought we said that whenever we run yarn start to start our React application, it bundles all our CSS together. Well, if we inspect the element, what we can see is that what Webpack has done is that it appended the name the dress, and it changed it so that every single time we call the dress, it has its own unique class. Here it has second page address 1bxvo, as opposed to this one with dbxsu. And what this allows us to do is emulate multi-page applications by saying, hey, I know that it's a single page application and we can't have the same CSS body, CSS class name for each div. And I'm going to make it so that we can change it dynamically and make it so that each instance of the dress is separate from the other one. Does anyone have any questions about single page applications versus multiple page applications and the differences between them? All right, cool. So now that we've talked about SPAs and MPAs, let's take a look at how we can emulate multiple pages in React, even though we know that it's only a single page. And one of the cool things we can do is use an external library like React Router DOM. And what they do is that it allows us to feel like we're going across different pages, even though we know that at its heart, it's all on the same web page. So first, let's look at React Router DOM and how we can use it to change our URL and to showcase different things on the page. And React Router offers a bunch of different routers, but for us, we're going to be using the browser router, which uses, and what the browser router is that it's essentially similar to this, where like if you go from page to page, you can use the back button to go to a different page. Like for instance, if I go on random num and then second page, and I press backwards, I go back to random number. And this allows us to essentially make it seem like we're going across different pages, even though we're all on the same page. Yeah, so we're using browser router. And if we want to use a router inside of our React app, we just have to wrap everything inside of a router tag, like so. And now that we've wrapped in a router tag, let's see how we can actually change the URLs. And something that we can do is use a link tag. Now, when we look at multiple page applications and how we want to move across different sites, what we see is that we use an A tag, which links to a different page, as so. But for React applications, what we do is we can simply do something similar to that and use a link. And in our example, when we have a link to equals slash, what this is that whenever we click on this button here, or any of these buttons, we change our URL to be like just slash or slash first or slash second and so forth. And let's take a look to see how we would use that. So if I go to base page, you can see in our URL, we just have localhost 3000. When I press first page, it changes to slash first. When I press second page, it changes to slash second. Yeah. So now that we've seen how we can change the URL, let's see how can we change what gets shown on the website when we change the URL. And the way we can do that is something called a switch. Now, if you guys took CS31, CS32 in the past, then we know that a switch, what it does is that you take in a parameter and based off of it, you conditionally go across one of different branches. And a switch in React Router is really similar. Like what we can see is that if we have switch here, we can change what gets shown based off of the path in the URL. Like if this is just a regular slash, then we're going to show this message. If the path says first, we're going to show first page. If the path says second, we're going to show the second page. And we can do this all within our switch statement and different routes. And let's take a look to see how this would work. So if I have first, we conditionally show the first page. And if the URL says slash second, then we conditionally show the second page, as so. And within a switch statement, some extra things you have to note is that when you try using it, what'll happen is that it'll choose the first path that contains the specified path in the URL. Like say this slash, for instance. If we took out the word exact, then our switch router wouldn't work because every URL by default contains slash. So it'll always show this route. And let's take a look at what will happen if we change that within our code base. Give me a sec. Here. If we change the word exact and take it out, let's see what happens. Yeah. No matter what, we don't get to see the difference between first and second page because every URL contains the slash by itself. And if you want to make it so that, I only want to show this page if it's only a slash, what you do is that you just add the word exact in, and it does that. Like so. Nice. Now we can see first page and second page. All right, now that we've seen the basics of just moving around our website and going across different pages, let's see how we can also pass data in to the URL. And URLs can be used for more than just rendering things on the page. We can also use the URL to pass in data to our website. Like, let's say, take this for instance. I have a random number that I want to pass in the URL, and I want to showcase it within the page we're on, like so. How would we do that? Well, inside of React Router, what we can do is that if we pass in a colon inside of our identifier for our path, what we can say is that, hey, I want to, whatever comes after this, I'm going to essentially use it as a variable or a URL parameter, and I'm going to use that later on. Let's take a look at how we can use URL parameters to showcase different things. Like take this for instance. We have a switch with root path equals current section. And that's going to be this little green thing that we see on the bottom of the page. Well, what this does is that it essentially says, hey, whatever goes after my URL, I'm going to call this current section, and I can use it as a variable inside of our component. And something similar like this is with the use params hook. So what use parameters does is that essentially says, hey, I want to use the parameters in the URL in order to show different things. Like say we are on the second page where it says the URL currently contains second. The way that we pass in second from our URL here is with use params. And what this does is says, hey, the URL says second in it, so this is going to be second. And you can see that here, where the URL currently contains first, second, or empty URL, or random. And we're doing that by passing in the first thing that happens after the slash with URL parameters. Does anyone have any questions about URL parameters and passing around data? Or real quick, does anyone know why inside of our use params hook, we have these angle brackets identifier params? Well, with these identifier params, what it is that it's essentially TypeScript's version of a generic. And use params means that, oh, I don't know what parameters are going to be passed in, so we can tell TypeScript through an interface like so, that the parameters are going to have a current section, which is a string, and we can pass it in like so. And if you want to see how it looks like, you can see our web page here in action, where when we click different things in the website, we change the URL, and we also change what gets shown on the bottom page. Nice. And now we're going to talk a little bit about something else we can use besides using the route and directly saying what's going to be inside of the route. Oh, we have a question here, which is, does use params basically mean a page inside of another? And that's a good question. And the way the use params hook work is that it basically uses the URL as data. And the way that we use params is that first, like inside of our app.tsx, you see how we have wrapped our entire app inside of a router. And by wrapping our app in a router, what we say is that we have given our entire React app knowledge of what happens inside the URL. So use parameters, it basically means that you don't need to be using it a page inside of another. What use parameters is that it's a way to tell your component what gets passed in the URL. If that makes sense. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so that was the use params hook. And now let's take a look at the render prop instead of the use params. And one of the things why some people don't like to use params sometimes is that there's the difference between a functional component, which we're all aware of in React, which is something that uses state, use context, and other what's it called? Other hooks like that. But if we want to use a pure component, which means that we don't use state or we don't use effect, and it's a function with no side effects, we can change it as using props with the render prop. And what the render prop is that we can change it to be like, oh, instead of specifically saying, I want to show the identifier inside of the current section, we can pass in a render prop which says, oh, whenever I go past this path, I want to render our page. And what this is that we're essentially passing in our current section as a string prop inside of our identifier function to change it so that instead of using the useParams hook inside of identifier, we can simply use regular props so that we can maintain a pure component with no side effects. And to reiterate what a pure component is, a pure component means that you don't have any logic that uses state or uses effect or cares about the React lifecycle. All that it cares about is the data that gets passed in as props through its parent components. And we can do this as so with a render prop and interfaces with TypeScript. Yeah. All right. And finally, one more thing we're going to cover is now that we've covered passing in URLs like first or second to showcase the first over here or second as here, how can we change it so that we pass in both the number 8 and 16 into our URL? And the way we can do that is with nested URL parameters. Like if you look inside of our link button, what we can see is that this is essentially a fancy JavaScript way of saying, oh, choose num10 is going to be a variable and choose num20 is going to be a variable. And what this is that whenever we click on the button to go to the random number page, we change our URL to have a number between 0 to 10 or 0 to 9 and a number from 11 to 20 as here. So now that we've made how we can change the URL or the link, let's take a look at how we can grab our URL parameters through our switch. And the way we can do that is with the same thing as before. Like before, how we said how we can grab the data from our URL by using a /:. We can do the same thing here with multiple /:. And when we use our useParams hook, we can say, oh, I want to grab both the first part of our component and the second part of our component. And the useParams hook is smart enough to know that, oh, whenever it sees a new /:, it separates the names of the parameters. So we can see first and second, like so. And we can see that whenever we click the button here, we have different numbers that gets generated in the URL. And we can also showcase them within our app like so. All right, so now that we've covered some things that React Router uses, but honestly, there's a lot more that we haven't covered, like query parameters, using history, recursive paths, and a ton more features that it offers for us. So far, the things that we've covered are showcasing different components based off of parameters, passing information to the components through URL parameters, and so on. And everything that you need to see is inside of our React Router documentation, if you want to take a look to see it from the source. And yeah, I hope that after this session, we learned a little bit more about some of the React internals, single page applications, and how to use React Router. All right. Thank you guys. See you guys in the next one.